Good morning, everybody. I'm Richard Moore. This is Richard Moore in Depth. And this morning, the topic is going to be here on Stray Thoughts and Straight Talk, a little segment I'm going to be doing more often as we go along, simply because these are better done recorded than they are written, because with my schedule, if they're written, they may not get written, if you catch my drift. The topic this morning that's really been on my mind all week long is we are not in power. That's the name of the topic. And so what I mean by that, if you're a conservative, what I mean by that is we are not in power. And we shouldn't be under the grand illusion that we are. And I want to talk about that in a second, but a few housekeeping details. First of all, next week, a new podcast of Some Things Considered with my co-hosts, Jennifer Meadows and Curtis Mang. We'll be up and running with that. I'll post that on the Substack, so stay tuned for that. Should be an interesting hour and a half, if we can shut ourselves up to end it at that time. In the meantime, you can check out Curtis Mang on his Substack. His last name is spelled M-A-N-G. You could just Google. It's called The Rights of Mang, but you can just Google Curtis Mang Substack, and it will come up. I have posted on the Substack, my Substack page, the first chapter, the introduction of The Rise of Bureaucratic Bossism. It is a sequel to the New Bossism of the American Left, and subsequent chapters will be posted online for paying members. And I want to talk about that for a second. There's going to be a raise in the rent, as it were. Come March 1st, I'm going to be raising the price of paid subscriptions simply because right now somebody can go in and for $7 access all my books, which I'm not saying they're all that valuable, but I would hope they're more than $7. So going to be a raise. I hope everybody would consider an annual subscription. That is the best way to support the Substack, to support this independent journalism. And I hope you'll join me with that. And I hope you'll spread the word as well. And again, you can also catch my writing over at the McIver Institute, and I'll post the latest on that. We're going to be talking about that as well. So let's get to the topic this morning, and that topic is we are not in power. And it's something that it occurred to me on several levels. I was listening to a YouTube presentation by the wonderful Victor Davis Hanson, and he was talking this week about the pitfalls of the upcoming midterm elections. He certainly sketched out some advantages that the Republicans have coming into the elections, mainly the economy. If the economy gets on track, as it appears to be early in the year, but if it really gets going in March, April, May, June, the Republicans could hold on to the House of Representatives. I'm not so optimistic as Victor is, but I see that as a very big potential. But he also laid out some of the things running against the Republicans in the midterms. The biggest, of course, being history. Usually the party in power, party that holds the presidency, loses seats. And of course, we know, I think it's 218 to 214 now. Is that the split? We know that the Republicans don't have a lot of seats to lose. So you've got history running against you. And then Hanson was talking about the unforced errors that the Trump administration was making. One that he pointed out, you did such a great job, Trump administration, in closing the border. The border is closed. But why go into a blue city in a blue state like Minneapolis and make a public spectacle? They didn't make the public spectacle, but by carrying out these large-scale operations, they provoked an organized counter-protest that ended up not looking good for the administration when two people ended up dead. And you can argue all about that you want. The Democratic base is going to have its take. We're going to have our take. But independence, I don't think it comes along so well. And Hanson didn't either. He says, why don't you go to Wyoming and Montana and do those operations there, and then go to Minneapolis and those blue cities after the election. So you have these kind of unforced errors. Another one that he mentioned was talking bad about the dead, as with Ron Ryder ended up murdered. And there was a lot of joking going along, and of course, you got the internet meme with the Obamas being dancing primates, and that, of course, has been a racist symbol for a long, long time in American history. None of these things need to be happening. We need to get back to the first 6 months of the Trump administration. We need to codify a lot of those executive orders that he did undertake and sign in the first 6 months of the administration, and let the policy do the talking. One of the things that Victor Davis Hanson didn't mention, which I will bring up now, is the fact that redistricting is, I hope not, but it probably is going to work against us. Again, the Trump administration, the Republicans started this in Texas with that redistricting move. Gavin Newsom countered with what could give the Democrats 5 additional seats in California, but it hasn't stopped there. And right now, the Democrats seem to be getting the better of the wars. Indiana rejected, a Republican state, rejected the Trump administration's a bid to redistrict there. But in Virginia, they're going ahead, and what is now a 6-5 Democratic majority could easily be a 10-1 Democratic majority. So redistricting is an existential peril in the midterms. If that happens, then all eyes turn to 2028. I think we have good, solid footing there. And but what'll happen if we lose the midterms? They'll impeach Trump. The agenda will be stopped. I don't think it's the end of the line like many people do. I think the real end of the line would be 2028 and what happens there. But I want to get back to the point of we're not in power. The Trump administration is in power, and it's done, as I've just mentioned, it's done a lot of good. I mean, we have gotten inflation under control. We have close the border. There are so many, the tariff revenues. I know that we're divided on the conservative side about that. I'm a fan of it. It's bringing in revenue. We have put Europe on notice about free speech. We have begun to wind down the forever wars, and I think there's good peace initiatives there. There's a lot of good things going on, but we have to put it in the larger context of power in this country, power in this globe. And when we look at it that way, it does look like the Democrats, if you look at the Democratic Party, is in disarray. And it does look like the left in general, the globalist in Davos, looks like they're in disarray. And they are in a lot of ways, because what Trump is most of all is a disruptor. He goes in, he disrupts the narrative. He disrupts more than that. He disrupts the infrastructure of the globalist state. But they still maintain a lot of power. And I would argue to you this morning that they are actually more in power than we are. They still control, just think of it this way, they still control the bureaucracies. And I'm going to get to that in just a second. They still control the nonprofit organizations. Yes, that's been disrupted, but there's so much money flowing through those left-wing nonprofit foundations, and they're out there putting that money into demonstrators' hands. They're behind the violent protest. A lot of that's still going on. They still control the legacy media, and more people still watch that than are on the internet and on alternative platforms. Although, again, we've made great inroads. None of this is to say that we're out of the ballgame by any means. There's a large swath of corporate America that is woke still and in the hands of the left. And most of all, what is still in the hands of the left are our public schools. Where have we put really universal school choice in place? Very few places. We haven't done it in Wisconsin. Even in southern states, there have been Republican opposition. South Carolina, other states have been Republican opposition. And until we break that monopoly, and that's our future, that's our children, that's our children's minds, until we break that monopoly, I'm going to tell you, we are not in power. Now, the question then becomes, how did this happen? How did the left capture these institutions? Well, in part, it's because the conservative movement was for many, many years asleep at the wheel. Not entirely, but frankly, we let it get out of hand. We let the bureaucracy grow. We sometimes, our Republican lawmakers, didn't want to pass tough legislation that would clamp down on the deficit or social policy because they wanted to kick it to the bureaucracies so that the bureaucracies could make the rules that everybody hated and they could blame the bureaucracies. But we let it get out of hand in so many ways. But one of the biggest ways we let it get out of hand was by constant so-called compromise. But was it really compromise or was it surrender? What is compromise? Compromise is where one side gives a little, one side gets a little, and we tend to view it in those terms starkly without context. But you have to put compromise into context. The context is if you get a little in the short term, what does it do for your long-term goals? And if it takes you away from your long-term goal, then that's not compromise, folks. That's surrender. Now, one of the examples that I will give you is that just a simple-minded fiscal example. So we come along, there's a program in Congress or at the state level, and the Democrats and the progressives say, okay, we want $2 million increase for this program. And we say, the Republicans, the conservatives say, no, we don't like this program. We think that it needs to be no increase. And the Democrats say, okay, but you've got to compromise, because if you don't compromise, you're being polarizing and this isn't the American way. You got to compromise. So the Republicans say, okay, we'll give you $1 million increase. Well, now we're $1 million further away from the goal of a balanced budget. We're deeper into the deficit. We've moved away from our goal. That's not compromise. And what makes it worse is that the next year, the same thing happens, rinse and repeat. The Democrats come back and they say, oh, we want another $2 million increase. No, we don't want. We gave you $1 million last year. We don't want any more increase. Well, you got to compromise. Okay, we'll give you another $1 million. Well, you can see how quickly that adds up over the years, and pretty soon you're at a $37 trillion deficit or whatever it is these days. It changes by the day very rapidly. Compromise cannot be surrender. And in that simple example, I would point out to you that if we had zero-based budgeting, that's nowhere near a compromise. We should have zero-based budgeting, and we could really talk about whether that program, whether it gets a $1 million increase or a $2 million increase or a zero increase, isn't the real question to ask. The real question to ask, and where real compromise could begin, is whether that program should exist at all. And we never question that, hardly, on the conservative side. And so through all these years, we've managed to give away all these institutions to the left because we've compromised, not just in the budget, but in the way we treat nonprofits and what we've given the teachers union in the schools and the federalization of education over the years. So that is where we've come to be. And now we're on this we're on this same track again in oh so many ways. And I want to just take you down the path just briefly of two situations we have here in Wisconsin, but it happens in every state. I know a lot of you are not in this state, but it happens in every state. So we talk about PFAS, and that's a national debate, the forever chemicals. So much of our lands are contaminated with these forever chemicals. Here in Wisconsin, there's a trust fund. I think it's got $125 million in it. And let me just say that I wrote about this in my last week's column for the MacIver Institute. And when I post this, I'll post the link to that column. And also earlier this week, I was on Vicki McKenna's radio show, wonderful radio show, and I love doing it. And we talked about that issue, and I'll point the link to her podcast and radio show also when I post this, so you can have both of those, the broadcast and the MacIver piece. But the question is, what got hung up, this $125 million in this remediation fund to clean up PFAS contamination hasn't been spent because they put it in the budget, but there's no enabling legislation for it. And the hangup has been liability for innocent landowners. Now, last summer, Jeff Mersaw and Eric Wimberger, two Republican lawmakers, came forth with legislation that I think was pretty good. And it seemed like then there were two camps on this issue. On the one side were Republicans, and what they wanted to do was to protect innocent landowners. And by that, I mean these are landowners whose properties are contaminated with these chemicals, but they didn't cause the contamination. They didn't discharge the contamination to other places. That's a bigger problem than most people think. And most of this PFAS stuff comes from firefighting foam, but it also comes from a couple of places. Now, they're paper mills. Now, paper mills are often passive receivers of these chemicals. They've long ago stopped discharging those pollutants into the water. They've long ago stopped creating these PFAS chemicals, but they are still passive receivers. They receive the pollution from upstream sources. So they have rigorous monitoring systems, and so therefore there's very early detection of these chemicals. So they're often the first sites where the chemical is detected. And that means everybody points the finger at them, even though they're not discharging the chemical and even though they didn't create the PFAS in the first place. So the idea, and the other thing that happens is that on large agricultural enterprises and other places, there's been a lot of land spreading where you take these biosolids and certain paper byproducts and you spread it over the land as a way to put nutrients back into the soil. And this has been for years encouraged by the DNR, but what they didn't realize at the time was that a lot of these stuff they were spreading over the land was contained PFAS. So now, are these landowners who did what the government asked them to do, are they going to be held liable? The whole idea was to not hold innocent landowners liable, and that was the Republican position. Now, the Democratic position, the environmental position, was just the opposite. Guess what? What they wanted to do was to punish innocent landowners. We're going to hold you liable. Now, why would they do this? Well, I couldn't really tell you. I'm not a progressive Democrat. I can only say that's what they do. They punish innocent people and making sure along the way that they carve out exemptions for government entities and progressive nonprofits and other organizations that might be on their side. They'll carve out exemptions for them. But every other entity, every private individual, every private landowner, you're guilty. And that's what they want. And that was a pretty clean debate. But then, after Eric Wimberger and Jeff Mersaw came out with their legislation, the environmentalists started whining about the big manufacturers. They were being let off. The private sector was being let off the hook. So guess what? Earlier, maybe late last month or earlier this month, and I can't tell you exactly what the status of the bill is today, Wimberger and Mersaw come out with a compromise bill, and it gives the boat away. It's not compromise. It's surrender once again. What they did was instead, now in the original version, the bill didn't pick winners or losers. You weren't guilty on the basis of who you were. You were guilty on the basis of what you did. Did you pollute? Did you discharge the pollutant? That was the strict liability concern that it was based on causation, not category, not status, not identity. You didn't pick winners and losers. Now, in the compromise, so-called compromise version, that's been flipped. That's exactly what happens. So you're exempt from liability, essentially, if you are a municipality or a local government entity. But if you're a private sector entity, a manufacturer, a member of the private productive economy, you are held liable. So you can see that right away, this is going to just really damage private business. It's going to go in through the entire chain of the economy. It's going to hurt small business. It's going to hurt Main Street as well as large manufacturers. And it's as if the Republicans have never heard of equal protection under the law. What is equal protection under the law? Here, you may have landfills are part of this whole process because, of course, they can receive materials that are full of PFAS chemicals. So you may have a municipal landfill that's chock-a-block full of this stuff, but they're exempt. But then over here, you have a private landfill, and there are many of them throughout the country and in Wisconsin, performing the same exact function, and yet they are liable. How is that fair? And so it's not fair, and it's also an economic catastrophe if it were to pass. And this is just another example of how we give away everything. We've got to stop giving away everything. Now I'll move to the much more local sector, but this is another demonstration of how this hypocrisy works, but it's also a good demonstration of how the deep state works. Up here in Oneida County, there is a DNR project, a boat landing project. Seems like a good project. Seems like they didn't have enough parking for the public boat landing. So what everybody noticed a couple of months ago is that the DNR had moved in and they had begun to put in a parking lot. I think it was going to be a gravel parking lot, no impervious surface, but they were cutting down trees. They were grading the landscape. They didn't even put up a silt fence, which is required. And guess what? Nobody knew about it until neighbors saw it. And the reason nobody knew about it is because the DNR didn't get any permits for the project. No. And when they were asked why they didn't, they're partnering with the Department of Administration on this. When they were asked why they didn't get any permits for the project, they said, we don't need them. We don't need permits for doing these kind of boat landing projects. And when they're asked why they don't need these permits, they refer you to a state statute. But the problem with the state statute, when you read it, is that it seems to say the exact opposite of what the DNR says. In other words, the state statute says when the state constructs a building, a facility, any kind of construction project, it is exempt from municipal construction, local ordinances, and construction standards, except zoning. So the work they were doing at the boat landing would have been shoreland zoning permits required. So it seemed to say that you need the permits. Now, this was an issue way back in the 90s, and they're still sticking with it. If you take a look at the model shoreland ordinance that the DNR gives to counties, it says this: state agencies are required to comply with and obtain all necessary permits under local shoreland ordinances. That's what they advise that counties adopt as their shoreland ordinances, yet they don't live by it. Then when you take a look at the law, and I got to find it here just real quickly, the law says any construction of a building, structure, or facility, quote, for the benefit of or use of the state is exempt from the local ordinances except zoning. These are the key words: for the benefit of or use of the state. So now, strapped with this except zoning, the DNR, it was doing some boat landing work. It didn't want to get local permits, but they were faced with this statute back in 1993. So the late George Meyer, who was the DNR secretary at the time, went to our elected legislature and said, could you write us a specific exemption into that statute so we don't have to get permits? Guess what? The legislature said, nah, we're not going to do that. We don't, that's not our intention. You gotta abide by the shoreline zoning thing. You got to get the permits. Well, George Meyer being George Meyer and the DNR being the DNR, what did they do? They went to the Attorney General for an interpretation of the statute. The Attorney General was the once and future governor then, Jim Doyle, far left Jim Doyle, who would later unleash the DNR to do just horrible, horrible things to the people of Wisconsin. And he then essentially, now this is just a classic case of gaslighting. He then read, when you talk about the state constructs a building, structure, or facility for the benefit or use of the state, he says, well, that means that the use of the state for an office building, for internal operations. It doesn't talk about for the benefit of the people. And so he turned the statute on its head and was able then to give an exemption, which the DNR and the DOA and every other state agency is relying on today. But here's an inconvenient truth for the DNR. Doyle's split scheme that he was concocted was never written into. It wasn't the statute. It wasn't articulated by the statute. It wasn't even hinted at in the statute. Nothing in that law draws the distinction between the use, benefit, and use of the state between internal operations and use of the public. The law does not say internal use. It does not say office buildings. It does not say except boat landings. And not only that, Doyle issued his opinion again after George Meyer had tried to get the exemption and failed in the legislature. And so what have you now? We have sort of like with the PFAS thing, we have the DNR, we have two sets of rules, one set of rules for you and me, one set of rules for the government, and they play by their rules. They take their rules and laws as suggestions, but they're laws for us. And once again, we have seen no challenge. Once again, we see no challenge from the counties, no challenge from conservative groups that say, you got to play once and for all. Everybody's got to play by the same standard. We can't afford to compromise on PFAS. That will sell our manufacturers and our economy down the river. And we also can't afford to sell our lakefront owners, our property owners down the river, or any other project, even off the lake. If we have to abide by the rules, they have to abide by the rules. They cannot credibly regulate when the prison walls they build, when they're standing outside those prison walls. They need to join us in the prison, and maybe then they'll be more inclined to set us free. We need to stop the compromise. And the only way we can stand up to these double standards, stand up to the the institutional capture by progressive organizations, is to stop calling it compromise when it is in fact surrender. And that's the takeaway today. Two points. We are not in power. These examples from Wisconsin, which are replicated across the country, are just the latest demonstrations of how we're not in power and how deep it goes. We're not in power. They control the institutions, and they will do so until we learn not to compromise. And that means that every compromise, if it is a compromise, does not set our goals backward. A short-term gain, if it in the long term sets our goals away from the standard, is a loss. And we need to stand up and be tough against the left now. I'm Richard Moore, and this is Richard Moore in Depth. Thank you.